Lord Crimson awoke on the morning of that fateful birthday to the usual tugging on his blankets. Without opening his eyes, he reached over the side of his bed to find Charlemagne's neck, and, in the hopes of gaining just a few seconds more of precious rest, rubbed it persuasively. The dog, however, would have none of it, and with that annoyingly insistent bark of his, ordered his master out of bed. In grim defeat, Lord Crimson sat up.
All right, boy, you win.
Slowly, he removed himself from his bed. Together, they walked to the enormous corner window which allowed the morning sun to shine in with a vengeance, and they stood looking out over the vast estate. With a heavy sigh, Lord Crimson bent down and gave his dog a pat.
I know that technically you're older than I am, but I feel it more than you do, don't I, boy?
The bloodhound whimpered softly and nuzzled his head against Lord Crimson's gentle hand.
Come on, Charlemagne. Let's take a walk, shall we?
That morning, like every morning, Lord Crimson and Charlemagne made the rounds of the estate. It was just over a mile, start to finish, and while not especially large when measured in terms of the great 18th and 19th century manors, in modern-day England it was enormous. The main house came into view as they walked over the hill toward the end of their hike, and the two friends stopped to catch their breath. His lordship scanned the countryside, and as his eyes came to rest on the manor, he made his thoughts known to his faithful companion.
Time's run out, Charlemagne. I'm afraid they've given up.
The post has come, sir, the head butler said as he opened the door, letting Lord Crimson and Charlemagne into the house. There's a letter from them.
Thank you, Mr. Portico. I'll be in the living room. The letter fetched and brought to his side, Lord Crimson said, Do me the favor of reading it aloud. I'm afraid I haven't the energy.
Very good, my lord. And with a 24-karat gold letter opener, Mr. Portico sliced the envelope in two. He removed the contents, shook out the single-page communication, and, holding it at arm's length, read as follows. To the Honourable Charles Albert Crimson III. Dear Lord Crimson, we regret to inform you that we have exhausted our current supply of ideas, and must now insist that you foist your eccentricities off upon one of our other able associates. We will be more than happy to make a recommendation, as it would serve no end of delight for us to witness any of our competitors in a turmoil while attempting, futilely, to satisfy your impossible and outlandish demands. We remain very sincerely yours.
I told you, didn't I, boy?
Wearily, he stood up and walked out of the room. Charlemagne tried to follow, but was told firmly to stay. His lordship wished to be alone.
For as long as he could remember, Lord Crimson had been plagued by nightmares. Nightmares which remained as much a mystery as the sorrow that seemed interwoven with his soul. For never could he remember even the slightest detail about them. But the cries he heard coming from his lips, and the torment and anguish he felt upon awakening, these he had no trouble at all remembering. That night, with some trepidation, Lord Crimson lay in his bed. Any added stress always brought with it another unwanted dream, and now, with one more architectural firm having given up the ghost, his distress had become wearisome indeed. The best in London were exhausted. He'd have to look elsewhere. But where?
The dream that night was different in one respect, and even as he sat bolt upright, screaming with the tears and perspiration pouring down his face, and his heart attempting to pound its way out of his chest, Lord Crimson realized what it was. Seconds later, when Mr. Portico came rushing into his lordship's chambers, the butler was greeted by an almost frantic request for pen and paper. The items were quickly rounded up and handed to his lordship, who then, and hardly knowing what he was about, wrote something down. Handing it to Mr. Portico, he said,
"Put this on the desk, please. We'll decipher its meaning in the morning."
The butler did as requested, and then hesitated, his concern weighing heavily. "May I get you something, sir? Perhaps some chamomile?" Lord Crimson shook his head. But still Mr. Portico didn't budge. He desperately wanted to do something, anything, to be of some little use.
"It's all right, Mr. Portico. Please, go back to bed."
"As you wish, sir. Good night." The next morning, and for the first time since he'd made the purchase, Lord Crimson didn't make the rounds of his property. Instead, he sat at his desk pondering the meaning of what he had written. Where could the name have come from? How should he act on it, if at all? And then, with a certainty that was as mysterious as the origin of the message itself, he understood that herein lay his final chance. He reached over and gave Charlemagne a pat.
"Get Mr. Portico for me, will you, boy?"
Charlemagne barked and trotted out of the room. A few minutes later he returned with Mr. Portico in tow. "My lord."
Handing the sheet of paper to his butler, Lord Crimson said, "Give this to Miss Havisham. I wish to know if a firm by this name exists, and if it does, I want a meeting with whoever runs the company. Whatever it takes, I want a meeting this week."